All right, and we're live. Tom Steyer, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Pleasure to be here.
So, we're here to talk about your new book, Cheaper, Faster, Better. The book focuses on how we can tackle the climate crisis, but it's also semi autobiographical. You weave in a lot of your own story and anecdotes from your life. So, with that in mind, could we start maybe with you talking about your decision to leave the world of finance and become a full time climate activist?
Well, to be fair, I've been back in the world of finance for over 3 years. So I did leave the world of finance for 8 full years, during which I'd started a hedge fund and run it for 27 years. And during those same 27 years, I was a partner and on the investment committee of a private equity firm, which I did. So for 27, and before that, I'd worked on Wall Street since I got out of college. So I'd worked for more than 30 years as a professional investor. I felt as if I had the luxury of being able to try and contribute to something that I thought was important, which was to move the country towards a more realistic and data-driven climate response. And so I felt super lucky to be able to do that. I'd gotten a good number of good things my way, and I felt like it was a chance for me to participate more broadly in our society.
Well, it's very inspirational of you to do that. Going back a little bit, how did your father's career, including maybe mainly his work as a prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials, impact your outlook on life and your work around climate?
Well, I know that my father, who was a lawyer his whole life and who graduated from law school at 21, went into the Navy for World War II after he got out of law school and stayed in. And then because he'd been a fancy lawyer at Yale Law School, was the assistant to the chief prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials, the first Nuremberg trials after the war, to prosecute war criminals. And I know that there's been this sense that he was an inspiration to me because of that experience. But the truth is that the people in our family have been interested in broadly contributing to society for certainly my father, but also my mother and my grandparents. And before that, I don't think that we've been unique as Americans by any stretch of the imagination. But I think that, like a lot of Americans, we feel as if the success of the country is a shared success that we both want to contribute to and enjoy. And I think that was my father's point in going into the Navy and volunteering and really having to work his ass off to get into the Navy. But I don't think it was really different from my grandfather's decision to be in the Army in World War I. And I think that I think that's a not atypical American response. And it's certainly one that I feel deeply. And I think hopefully my kids feel deeply, and my brothers. And I don't think that puts us out of the mainstream of America. I think I got a chance to do it more clearly because I'd made a bunch of money and could have literally afford to do it. And so I could indulge my deepest desires. And that was one.
One of the things you talk about in the book is that there are benefits in life to being an outsider, but there are costs too. And you identify one of those costs as a frustration tax. What is the frustration tax, and why is it a tax that climate activists often have to pay?
Well, I mean, the example that I give is being a non-recruited athlete at a D1 school, where basically they've probably recruited 3 times as many people to come to the school specifically to be on the team. And the last thing they need is somebody else. They promised them all that they're going to start. And therefore, if you're not one of those people, you're more of a pain in the neck than anything else because they have their plan and you're disrupting their plan. And that's hard for people to get away from. So the good news is that you can be realistic and data driven and do the right thing. The hard part is, of course, you're fighting City Hall, and fighting City Hall is really hard. Every single status quo institution, organization protects itself. And so to change that, there's a huge frustration. And, I could give you multiple examples, and the one I chose was the most benign. But I mean, my son did the exact same thing in college, walked onto a team that had 32 recruits for 10 spots. And, in terms of a frustration tax, I mean, they made him dress in a different locker room and have completely different behaviors in order to just compete to see if he was one of the 10 best people on the team.
Right. And you talk about how people paying the frustration tax, if they want to affect large scale change in the world, they have to operate both as an outsider, and often outsiders are the people that sort of think differently and drive change, but also know how to operate as an insider and that they can build relationships and sort of build a coalition. Can you talk about trying to find that right balance, particularly in the world of climate?
Well, let me first talk about the world of sports for a second. I mean, you're trying to get onto a team and shake up what the coach and all of the recruits have expected and think they deserve. And then you have to be teammates with the people and, help carry out the strategy of the coach and be teammates with the 9 other people who are going to be the starters. So yeah, you have to be on both sides of the fence in order for that to work, because you can't be on a team unless you're part of a team, literally. And that implies, beyond someone putting a starting position next to your name. I think in terms of climate, what are we trying to shake up? I mean, we have the world's biggest industry, energy, with some of the most profitable businesses in the world who absolutely love it and who have the playing field tilted in their direction in very deep ways, multiple deep ways. And you're talking about taking that away, and who wants to give that up? So yeah, that's, and at the same time, you have to fit into an energy system. You have to be part of the system. You have to raise money. You have to build businesses. You have to have customers. It seems to me to be quite similar. You're disrupting the system while joining the system.
Speaking of the energy industry, why is capitalism rather than collective action the best tool to fight climate change?
Well, I don't think that there's any way for it to be just capitalism, because I think, one of the things I try and say in the book, and which I try and say publicly as someone who's an MBA and a long-term business person, is there is no such thing as a free market. All markets have rules, and the rules for energy are going to determine at some level how things shake out. So, we can never be just capitalism. At the same time, if you want to marshal huge amounts of money and you want to build things and you want to do it effectively, real time, with deep incentives in place for people to do the right thing, capitalism is the way that's worked all around the world. And so if we're going to get this done, and especially if we're going to get it done quickly and efficiently, capitalism is the only choice. And I think capitalism is not either moral or immoral. People follow the incentives in capitalism driven by society's rules, both specifically the written legal rules and also, to some extent, the unwritten rules of society. And if you look at American capitalism, going back to since people started wandering over here from Europe, the rules of capitalism have permitted and encouraged some things that we now would consider miles beyond the pale. And that was considered absolutely okay. The example I use is because it's the least emotional, even though it's emotional, is the idea of employing a 12-year-old for a 14-hour day for a quarter. Nowadays, if you brought that up, people would think you were insane. But that was kind of par for the course in American history. So the rules matter, but if you really want to get things done, you really have to organize around businesses, and profits drive scale. And we need scale here.
Let's talk about green premiums. This is something we talk about often when we are having our investment committee meetings. We generally try to invest in businesses that are commercializing products with green discounts instead of green premiums. But you brought up a point in the book that I thought was spot on, which is that the oil and gas industry, to some degree, their products have a premium baked in, but they have all these tax breaks that essentially allow them to operate successful businesses. But climate companies are not really afforded that same leeway from the public. People will complain about subsidies and tax breaks that are helping solar and EVs come to cost parity. But they, for a certain reason, that same criticism is not lobbied on oil and gas companies. So how have you seen that sort of double standard play out as you've embarked on this climate activism journey?
Well, I don't even think that I'd take a little bit of issue, Andrew, with your characterization, because I think for a long time, clean energy, and specifically we're talking here about electricity generation, was more expensive on a per kilowatt hour basis. But that hasn't been true for a while. The amount by which clean energy is cheaper than fossil fuel energy continues to grow and will continue to grow and is already really big. I think there's a misconception on many, many, many people's mind that fossil fuels are cheaper. They're not. Even fossil fuel companies don't argue that. I mean, that argument has been buried several years ago. The truth is, solar and wind are the two cheapest sources of power in the electricity generation pie chart, and by a lot. And that is something that will continue to grow really substantially. I think the advantage that fossil fuel companies make in terms of electricity generation, and let's deal with EVs in a second, is that they're not intermittent. And so the argument is we're always going to need them. You know, if you have to have 24/7, 365, you need fossil fuels that the wind doesn't blow sometimes, the sun doesn't shine every night, and the batteries aren't good enough to turn that into 24/7, 365. And there's a lot of problems with that argument. The truth is, we're going to get a lot better batteries. We're going to have a couple sources of clean baseload power, and that we can get very far on the grid with 24/7, 365 with a very small amount of fossil fuels. And so people overplay this as a way of doing the thing that is the easiest thing to do, because it's easy to borrow money for natural gas. It's easy to borrow money for natural gas facilities. And it's something where it's easy to get natural gas delivered once you have pipelines. And so to a large extent, it's about ease and the promise of no downtime that are the current advantages of fossil fuels, not cost. Definitely the opposite of cost. They're clearly more expensive and will continue to get more and more expensive relatively. The question is going to be about certainty. When you talk about EVs, I think we all know at this point that there is a $14,000 BYD plug-in hybrid that goes 1,200 miles, $14,000. I mean, that is a disruptive product. I think we're looking at Stellantis talking about a $25,000 EV. As the cost of batteries goes down another 80% this decade, we're going to see EVs be clearly cheaper, not just in terms of life cycle cost, which I believe they are now, but in terms of upfront cost too. So when we really see it, once again, this is not going to be about cost. It's not going to be about how the cars handle. If you've driven an EV, which I'm 100% sure you have, or I'd say 99, just to be polite, then you know that they have better pickup and they handle better. That's not the issue. The issue is going to be the same issue that I was talking about in terms of the electricity generation, which is ease of filling up, sort of the practicalities of getting things done in the real world. That's what everybody's going to worry about. They're going to worry about, can you fill up? How long does it take? Range anxiety, not about whether the car is cheaper, because it's clearly going to be cheaper. And let me say, if you look at most of the world, they don't drive as far as Americans drive. They don't drive 5,000-pound cars. If you look, I don't have the numbers for June or July, but in May in China, the percent of new car sales that were EVs was 44%. We're seeing in a lot of places, and let me say that last year globally, the percent of renewable electricity, the new electricity generation in 2023 that was renewable was 86%. It's not like this revolution is coming. This revolution is here. And the question is, how fast does the change happen? And how fast, as the number of new cars and new electricity generation happens, that's the change. But you have this whole stock of cars that are already operating that continue to operate. So it's a question of how fast does the new sales, the new generation, change the overall percentages. That's really what's going on.
Let's fast forward 30 years. When people are reflecting back on the oil and gas industry at this time, do you think the decisions that they made will be viewed as sort of an innovator's dilemma problem, like they were sort of facing one and they didn't handle it correctly?
I think it's very hard to ask people who are making trillions of dollars to change their business to businesses they're not sure that they'll make money. Yeah. And so, does it surprise me that there were three dominant American car manufacturers who had the technology, and yet by far the leader in electric vehicles in the United States was a startup? No. Does it surprise me that most of the new drug discoveries are done by biotech companies as opposed to established, huge, powerful pharmaceutical companies? No. Do I expect that the new baseload technologies, the new solar technologies, the new wind technologies, the new batteries will not be developed by huge American energy companies? No. That's the nature of technology, is that it's very, very hard for people who are making a lot of money to try and cannibalize their own business. And that's true for a whole bunch of reasons that sounds so superficial to me. I mean, the truth is, if you and I had a company and we were making a lot of money and you'd made all the money and I said, let's cannibalize your business, which has carried us, which is paying the tuitions of our kids, our mortgages, our food costs, and let's cannibalize this because I have an idea that might work. So your kids might be able to go to college and we might be able to make our mortgage payment. Really? You think that's a good idea? Let's just hang in here and keep making a lot of money. What do you say to that? I just think that's a natural human thing. And so I can see from my job as an investor in the energy transition that there is just amazing stuff happening. And it's mostly happening from startups, not from huge companies.
I'm curious to hear your thoughts on permitting. One of the topics you brought up in the book is that the traditional environmentalist movement has sort of made a transition to addressing the climate crisis. Some of the playbook that they have used historically, when deployed sort of in the current context of the climate crisis, might not be the sort of most optimal way to go about it. And as we're trying to build all of this renewable energy infrastructure, permitting is one of the bottlenecks out there. So I guess I'm curious just to hear your thoughts on permitting and then to some degree the traditional, yeah.
You know, there's an old expression that's a cliche, the perfect is the enemy of the good.
Right.
And the idea that you can build huge new things in undeveloped country and not disturb things and not have negative externalities is I'm going to go with pretty unlikely, and I'm being nice. So, for instance, I've had two people who I've talked to within the last month, both of whom have worked on major new grid access from the middle of the country to the left coast. I think both have succeeded in getting their permits. One of them took 18 years. One of them took 16 years. I asked the guy who it took 18 years, because obviously he didn't think it would take that long. He thought it would be much faster. I said, would you do this again? He said, I'd rather slit my throat. And so to a large extent, what that says to me is, and this is true in a lot of ways, it's very, very hard to build infrastructure in the United States of America. I'm not making a moral judgment. I'm making a data-driven number. And so that's true because it's very, very hard to get permits for a whole bunch of reasons. But it means what that says to me is a lot of our change is going to have to take place within the existing footprint. There's a lot of stuff that's been permitted in the 19th century, in the 20th century, and in the 21st century. It doesn't have to be re-permitted, that you're not going to be destroying anything by using that in a new way. And it seems to me that an awful lot of the stuff that's going to happen is going to happen with the existing footprint if we're going to move at the pace we need to move. Because if it takes us 7 years to build offshore wind, to permit and build offshore wind, and we have a window between now and 2030 to really make a big difference, it seems like that last I checked, 4 and 7 is 11. That takes us outside our window. So to a large extent, we're going to have to be creative in terms of how we use our existing footprints across the board in order to get stuff done, because at least in this country, it's very hard to do new infrastructure, and you can see it. I think around the world, that may be more or less true, shall we say.
Yeah. On the individual sort of intrinsic motivation front, you brought up Victory Gardens in the book. I had never heard of Victory Gardens.
Really?
No, I hadn't. It's a good phrase. Can you explain the history behind Victory Gardens and to some degree how they apply to our current addressing of the climate crisis?
My point in the book at some level is this is an all of society response, not just a business response, that we have to decide as a society this is important to us. And the example I used where we decided something was important after dithering about it for a long time was World War II, where we had a huge disagreement within the United States of America about whether that was our fight, whether it had to be our fight, and whether we could afford it, because we were still in the Depression. Everybody felt really, really poor and really, really stretched, and it was a European war, and why is that our problem? And then there are other people who are like, it's inevitably our problem. The sooner we face it, the better. But and so that was going on for years before Pearl Harbor. And after Pearl Harbor, basically everybody decided, okay, we have to do this because these people have declared war on us and they're trying to kill us. So we better deal with that. And one of the things that people did in World War II, and I also believe in World War I for what it's worth, is people took their gardens and started to grow vegetables. And they did it as a symbol, but also a substantial difference to how much food could be sent to the troops overseas. So it's like if you're growing your own corn and tomatoes and beans and squash and eating them, you're not buying them in the store and you're not buying them from somebody's farm, and the stuff from that farm can then be sent to the troops. So it was a symbol of patriotism and solidarity. Now, my point in it was a definite statement about who you were and what you cared about. It did make a difference, but it's very far from the reason we won the war. Maybe the fact that we all cared was the reason we won the war.
Right.
But that caring took a lot of different means of expression. And one of them was, famously, the president asked the big three car companies, how much are you going to be willing to dedicate to the defense effort after Pearl Harbor? And they said, we're patriotic Americans like everybody else. We're going to go to 20%, no problem. And he was like, okay, here's your number, 100%. And we didn't make another passenger car until the war was won. And we made planes and we made tanks and we made ships and we churned them out like no one could ever believe. But it was basically a statement. We are in it to win it. And that is really what I think American society is at its best, when we have a society-wide agreement on something we need to achieve together, and then we go achieve it. And in so doing, kind of refresh what our country stands for, refresh our acceptance and coordination, community with everybody else in the country, regardless of geography or partisanship, that we understand that we have something important to do and we go do it. And by the way, made the United States a much richer country, as well as a much more unified and successful country. And that's how I see the climate fight, is something where, look, this is something we can definitely do if we choose to do it. But we're going through a phase of, do we really need to do it? And to me, that's a question that's been asked and answered.
Right.
But it hasn't been asked and answered all the way through our society, although most Americans, including most registered Republicans, agree.
Tom Steyer, your commitment to solving the climate crisis is inspiring. And I want to thank you for coming on the podcast today to talk about it.
Well, I want to thank you for having me, Andrew. Seriously, I appreciate it. And my request is for everybody to look at the data and think about what a huge opportunity this is for us as a country. Definitely as a huge economic opportunity, as a chance for us to continue to lead the world, which is something I think the world needs us to do and we need to do. And also for a chance to recognize each other's strengths, and that, we can do things together and stop being so angry at each other and partisan. This is a great chance for us to remember how well we do when we come together.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Tom. It's much appreciated.
Ciao.